Today's lesson is about finding the square root of a number. First thing you're going to want to do is take out your PDF or printout of the multiplication table. And to understand square roots, it's important that we review squared numbers. So if you have something like 2 squared, it means 2 times 2 and it gets you 4. If you have something like 3 squared, it means 3 times 3 and it gets you 9, and so on. So what you're going to do is you're going to highlight on your multiplication chart all the numbers that are answers to squares. In other words, all the numbers that are a result of multiplying a number by itself, like 1 times 1, or 2 times 2, or 3 times 3, or 4 times 4, or 12 times 12, and so on. Because that chart will be really useful as we go over square roots today. Now, square roots are defined as a symbol that tells you to figure out what number was squared to get this particular number as an answer. A square root symbol looks a little bit like a division symbol, but with a little edge on the end, a little hook, like a fish hook. When you see this square root symbol, it's really asking what number was squared to get the answer inside of the square root symbol. What number is multiplied by itself to get, in this case, 16. So you want to think of numbers, maybe look at your multiplication chart, see if you could find a number times itself that gets you 16. Oh, 4 times 4 works. So that's your final answer. The square root of 16, the number that was squared to get an answer of 16, was 4. Box your answer. Really quick, I'm also going to show you how to check your answer because it's helpful on tests. Remember, square root is asking what number was squared to get this answer. So let's see what happens when we square 4. 4 squared really means 4 times 4, and it gets us 16. Yes, it gets us a number in the box. 4 is the correct answer. You want to need to check your work for all these problems, but it's good to know for important questions on quizzes and tests. Go ahead and see if you could break down 25 into a number times itself. If you got 5, well done. Pause here and try numbers 3 through 6. (81) breaks down into 9 times 9, so the number squared was 9. That's your answer to the square root problem. 1, you could break down into 1 times 1, so the square root of 1 is 1. 121 breaks down into 11 times 11, so the square root of 121 is 11. 6 is interesting. If you ever see a negative outside of the square root, it really just means you're going to have a negative version of your answer. It sticks around in front of your answer. So when you square root 49 and you got 7, there was already a negative in front of that, so negative 7 is your final answer. Pause here and finish the rest of the front page. Go ahead and check your answers. Sometimes you have a square root number that isn't on your chart because the number is square root bigger than 12. When that happens, you want to create a factor tree or break down your number into things multiplied together in any way you can, even if it's not necessarily to the same number. So let's walk through number 1 together. If I want to factor tree 225, I want to first start with thinking of 2 numbers that can multiply to get 225. Now, this is one of the rare times where you're allowed to use a calculator, so I take out either a calculator or a calculator app out for this bit. Now, I need to find a number that would divide 225 well, without any fraction or decimal part to the answer. Because 225 ends in a 5, I can assume that dividing by 5 will work, because when you think of multiples of 5, counting it by 5s, 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30, 35, 40, you notice how everything that ends in a 5 or a 0 is a multiple of 5, meaning we could divide numbers that end in 5 by 5. So on your calculator, divide 225 by 5, and you get 45. So that tells you that 5 times 45 is one way to break down 225. There's no way to break down 5 more without breaking it down into itself, like 5 times 1, which doesn't really make it smaller, but we could break down 45 more. Because that ends in a 5, we could divide by another 5. 5 times 9 is one way to break down 45. 5 doesn't break down into anything smaller, but 9 does. So if we list out all the prime numbers we got, all the numbers that did not break down anymore in this problem, we have 5 times 5 times 3 times 3. So when we're asking what's the square root of this combo, 5 times 5 times 3 times 3, we really want to respond with, well, what numbers were squared? We have a 5 squared here, a 5 times itself, and we have a 3 squared here, a 3 times itself. In other words, when we square root that, we say, well, there's a 5 squared and a 3 squared. We can multiply both those answers together and say the final answer is 15. Let's check your answer. Let's see what happens when we square 15. 15 squared gets you 15 times 15, which does get you 225, so you can be pretty confident you're right. We're going to walk through one more together. Now, looking at 196 and trying to think of a number that will divide it and get a whole number answer, if it ends in an even number, it will divide by 2, because all even numbers are multiples of 2. So on your calculator, take 196, divide by 2. Now 2 doesn't break down any smaller, but 98 does. Because it's still even, we could still divide by 2. 49 is not even, but if you look at your chart, 49 can break down into 7 times 7. So when we take the prime factors, the branches of your factor tree that could not break down into anything smaller, we have 2 times 2 times 7 times 7. That's a 2 squared and a 7 squared. So when we're asked what numbers were squared, well, we say, well, we had a 2 and a 7. 2 times 7 is 14. To check your work, you want to see what 14 squared becomes. 14 squared does get you 196, which was what we started with. Pause here. Try the next 2 on your own. So here's a tip. If you ever see a number ending in 2 zeros, it's going to divide by 100 really well. So one of the multiple ways you could break this down is into 9 times 100. There's other ways as well. I'll go over one of them to show you how it gets you the same answer no matter how you start off breaking it down. The 9 breaks down into 3 times 3. The 100 can break down into 10 times 10. Now, the 3's can't get any smaller when you break them down. You can only break them down into 1 times 3, which doesn't shrink it, so you don't bother. But the 10's can if you really wanted to. However, it's already a pair of the same numbers, so I usually don't bother to break it down further if they already match. If I really wanted to, though, I could break it down into 2 times 5 here and here.